exactly.
All right. Okay. I'm having a wonderful chat with Eileen Keillor in Ottawa. And Eileen, I think we've had a little chat, and I think you are Canadian, of course, living in Ottawa. You're a musicologist and a pianist. Stop me if I'm wrong anywhere here. Professor of music at Carleton University in Ottawa since 1977. Now that tells me longevity. that,
Well, I actually haven't been teaching a course there so for a few years, but they still have me on.
okay, well, there
It's
you
a
go. That's
distinguished research professor.
Oh, so that's already impressive. They've given you a special title for the, but when I see that kind of longevity, it's fabulous. And you specialize in Canadian composers, as we're about to discover, and music of North American indigenous groups. Fascinating. The whole thing is fascinating. And let's not forget child prodigy. I'm really clear now from what I've read about you at the piano. The first female recipient of the doctoral degree in musicology at the University of Toronto. Now that's whom I'm talking to this evening, and we're discussing her curation. I think we got this right. You have curated an absolutely wonderful CD release, La Patrie, Our Canada, Canadian Orchestral Music from 1874 to 1943. It's a center discs release in Canada. All that good information, plus our interview is going to go up at performingartsreview.net. But, I'm a Yankee. I'm an American. I want desperately to know about all of my neighbors in terms of music and art and everything else. And the truth is, Canadian music, we Americans in particular don't know a whole lot about Canadian music, and this CD gives us a beautiful, beautiful overview. And more importantly, and then I'm going to let you go at it here, is that this entire CD, stop me here now because we're getting into dangerous territory, is a an approach called Symphonova, this orchestral experience, because this is an orchestral sound, and Shelley Katz is the symphonist, which is to say this man is in charge. He conducts literally this experience. I hope I'm okay. You're going to correct me in a second, but it is all electronic, with the exception that of course, we're talking about 12 musicians that make the basis, that make the real sounds, that then become manipulated in the most beautiful, beautiful way by Shelley Katz, I presume, to create really a delicious orchestral sound that is not artificial and phony. It's really a new technology that's exciting. Okay, your turn. Get me out of this.
Yes, well, he has developed a number of techniques to be able to produce this quality of sound. And I think one of the first important elements of it is his SVAS system, which is the ambience that it creates in whatever space the musicians are located in. He can manipulate the acoustics of that space to become, for instance, the Amsterdam Concertgebouw, if he wishes, or it could be the Berlin Concert Hall, or so on and so forth. There are a number of possibilities, but it means that he's able to control at least the acoustic ambience around the musicians. And then he has the actual musicians, but for instance, for the violin, he has one violinist. And what he sets up is a whole group of violins. He buys, relatively cheap violins and puts a microphone inside each one of them, which he can manipulate to create the resonance of a Stradivarius. And then through his magic conducting wand, he can bring the sounds of those other violins into the sound that his actual violinist is making. And he's also able, all of the works that he performs, he has them put into a special digitized program so that if, for instance, the composer has split the violin section, he's able to do those divided lines through his wand.
Oh,
Does that give
Lordy.
you a bit of an idea of what he
Oh
does?
Lordy, I don't know when do I pick my melted brains up off the floor here? That is so exciting, and for everybody to know, because we're dealing with a lot of professional musicians watching this, do not fret, do not worry. This is not the robot taking over. It's about really
Yes.
just enhancing an experience.
Yes.
In a very good way, and using live musicians. You've just described that these
Mhm.
can be
That's
live
right.
experiences. And just to let me finish, the idea is I have just finished reviewing an organ recital in I can't I haven't really written the review, but I heard the CD. You know, the organ recital is billed as being in such and such, Reims Cathedral in France, and of course it is. Every single sound of that organ has been digitalized, and the organist, no offense, but I'm exaggerating, but sitting in his back bedroom is using all of those digital sounds, playing his own, at his own level of expertise. It's perfectly legitimate, but capturing all that sound. Am I anywhere close to what this is? It's marvelous.
Mhm. Well, his hope is, I mean, he wants to be able to take orchestral music to places that simply would never have the experience of having a full orchestra. So, I mean, for Canada, that is really a need because we're such a small population spread out over a huge country. We have a lot of remote communities that have never experienced orchestral music. And his dream is to take his Symphonova to these communities and let those residents experience what orchestral sound can really be.
Absolutely perfect. He will go to heaven, and there will be a plaque there in Ottawa somewhere on the side of some building in the next century. All right, let's now that we kind of understand the pretext of what the sound is on this CD, and let me just again repeat, it's fabulous. It's orchestral sound. I mean, this technique is really superb, and again, it uses live musicians, so we're not cheating too many people out of a paycheck, but it's also very sensible in this day and age to have the opportunity, as you've just described, to bring orchestral music to I want to think of a town in Canada with a deer with a moose name on it. Moosehead something anyway, a place like that. And I'm trying not forgive me, I don't mean to be offensive, but the point is just small areas. Same in the US. Give me a small town in Montana. Come on. And give a small audience that first thrilling experience of seeing 7 or 8, let's say, musicians playing, but also hearing this orchestral sound as appropriate according to the repertoire being performed. Now you have functioned as curator for this CD. One CD. This isn't a 2 CD release. This is just one little CD. La Patrie, Our Canada, a sampling from let's say, if I remember correctly, about the mid 19th century into the mid and late 20th century. First of all, how did you make the decisions?
Well, for a number of years, I was head of the Canadian Musical Heritage Society. And I don't know whether you've ever heard of that organization,
I don't want to admit whether I have or not.
but if I put up one volume here,
Oh, there you go.
uh, uh, we published 25 volumes of Canadian music
Wow.
written before 1950.
Wow.
And we organized ourselves in the early 1980s. And this was largely under the direction and influence of Dr. Helmut Kollmann. You and probably a lot of your listeners and viewers have heard of the Encyclopedia of Music in Canada. And Dr. Kollmann was responsible for bringing that to fruition. And one of the things that we discovered, because many of us were involved in writing articles and entries for that encyclopedia, we'd often end up, with a composer that we could find some biographical information about and possibly lists of works that he was supposed to or she was supposed to have written. But where were the works?
Hmm.
We had names, but not the works. And so the Canadian Musical Heritage Society was founded to actually search out these compositions if we could. And in the process, we decided to limit ourselves to before 1950 because, of course, the Canadian Music Centre had been founded and it largely uh, dealt with compositions written from 1950 on.
I see.
So we decided that we would concentrate on the earlier period. And so in the process of our existence, we discovered and tracked down around 35,000 compositions.
Amazing, amazing.
So we, as I said,
as I said, how did you make your whatever 12 choices without being
that's,
assassinated by
well,
someone else?
uh, among the 25 volumes that we put out by the Society, we chose a little over 1,000 works to include in those volumes. But we had 3 volumes devoted to orchestral music. And I happened to edit 2 of those. And Dr. Coleman had done the first one. So we had these orchestral works. And of course, I've been wanting to get these things actually played. And I've been, begging orchestras in Canada to play these things. But of
Let me
course,
jump in for just a second because you have
yes,
just described what I thought was coming, but it's the same trouble that occurs in America as well. New, or maybe anywhere, although I think Europe is way ahead of us, but the idea of new music or even our own countrymen's music in America and Canada, it's like nobody wants, they don't want to risk the audience or what, I don't know what it is. It's crazy. Excuse me, go ahead. So you are not
yes,
alone in this
that's right. And
mission.
and I think particularly with older music, I mean, usually newer music that is commissioned, there's usually a little clause in there that has to be performed, or actually the orchestra has commissioned it, and so it does at least get one performance. A lot of composers get
Exactly.
very frustrated, one performance.
Exactly.
But for this earlier material, that just seemed to be even more of a brick wall there in trying to get interest. And I thought the important thing was for them to actually hear it, because I think some of these are quite wonderful works.
Yes, I have double crosses and stars after several. We'll get there before the evening's out. Go ahead.
Yes. So, having known Shelley Katz and being aware of what he was trying to develop, I should go back and just say why he decided to try to invent such a system. He served for many years as a repetiteur and a conductor at opera houses in Germany. And one of the things that he found there was frequently the opera house would be asked by local communities around to bring their productions out to those smaller communities. But of course, the opera house would say, "Oh, there's no way we can do that. We can't transport 90 musicians and all the sets and all the singers and so on and so forth." And so Shelley started to think about, well, can I come up with some way of producing a genuine orchestral sound, but not use as many resources? And so this was at the back of his thinking. And he's, of course, been working on it for years, trying to come up with a solution.
Well, I can tell you it's a very successful, excuse me, solution because the sound is orchestral. There is nothing electronic. If you get my drift, I mean my ears are
Mhm.
pretty
I
pretty
know.
good here. The
Yes.
sound is so orchestral, and again, for those who may be nervously anticipating this, it is not about eliminating musicians. It's about taking more of our art form to more people in a very acceptable and exciting manner. I mean, if it's lousy, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes
Mhm.
people mean well. They take lousy productions out into the country, and the countryside says, "Nah, we'll never go there again." But
Yes.
so anyway, the result, and that's why I wanted to get there because I'm actually, I am in fact reviewing the CD,
Mhm.
and I'm actually
Mhm.
reviewing a performance of legitimate musicians, but they have been enhanced. And I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Now let's have a look at this really beautiful and as you mentioned, let's just skip around a little bit because I'm
Mhm.
just checking the time. But for example, Ernest Macmillan, uh,
Yes.
uh, this overture of his is just an absolutely heroic tone poem. Do you remember a bit about this wonderful? It's a beautiful orchestral piece. I see here I have notes about sprites up joyously, positively. It's Respighi like, then heroic, and the big tune and drum. I mean, it's a marvelous piece, and I'm sure it is not performed nearly enough. What do you have an idea of the years? I was not quite sure. I figured probably the 40s or something. Just guessing.
No, it was done before that.
Ah,
It was performed by the Toronto Symphony. Uh, the present Toronto Symphony Orchestras was formed in the early 1920s. And he conducted the first performance of this overture with them. I think it was 1924, if I remember my dates correctly.
beauty.
But Sir Ernest Macmillan, he was knighted in the 1930s. Sir Ernest Macmillan played a major role in music in Canada, and for many years he was referred to as Mr. Music in Canada. He was that
Interesting.
important.
Interesting.
And but he had a rich background to draw upon because after his early studies in Canada, he had gone to Britain, to the UK, and he had decided that he wanted to attend the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth. And that was in 1914.
Oops.
So he was taken as a prisoner of war. And he was in the camp outside of Berlin during the First World War. And he put together an orchestra there, a chamber ensembles, conducted. They put on operettas, and so he had sort of hands-on experience of doing this kind of thing. And I would think that there were probably some very good musicians available that were able to work with him. And he completed his doctorate in music from Oxford University, and then came back to Canada. So this was one of his compositions that he came up after he got back to Canada.
Is he responsible for a large number of works? Is he performed in Canada often, like a symphony or two or
Well,
something?
he did not write that much because he got very busy. I mean, he soon became the conductor of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. He was conductor of the Toronto Mendelssohn Choir. He became head of the what is now known as the Royal Conservatory of Music, was the Toronto Conservatory of Music at that time. So he was a very busy person, and I think the composition got sort of shoved aside. But he obviously had great abilities in that area.
Yeah, beautiful. Very programmatic, very landscape-like, beautiful uh, imagery, beautiful imagery in that overture. Let's look at Clarence Lucas for a minute. I've got a few stars after this one. His overture Macbeth,
Yes,
1901.
yes.
I loved it. I
Yeah,
loved it.
isn't it fascinating?
Here are my notes. A superb piece of descriptive English music of the Edwardian period, and he's Canadian, forgive me. Narrative, colorful, even a little bit of fun. It's just a beauty. It should be performed a whole lot more. Lucas, Clarence Lucas, Overture Macbeth. Tell me a little bit about this one from 1901.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing, of course,
Excuse me.
is that it had its premiere in Chicago
Good. I'm happy for Americans.
under Theodore Thomas. Clarence Lucas did a lot in the United States because he brought the first production of Peer Gynt and did a tour all across the states with that.
Interesting.
And it was the first production of the play with Grieg's
With the
music.
music, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Fabulous.
And for years he was a writer for the musical Courier, and
So much more.
he was very fond of photography, and he would go around and he would take photographs of the places where composers lived, or their tombstones and so on, and he would do articles, right, and often have a photo in that he had taken of wherever it was. But in in Canada, because of our sort of dual nature of being a French colony and then a British colony, we have the sort of French and English traditions. Now, usually our Anglophone composers tend to go to the UK or they go to Germany for further studies, or they did in the 19th century. But Clarence Lucas was unusual because he went to Paris.
Very intelligent.
Yes,
Much better weather, at very least.
that's right. And so he studied
Interesting.
at the Paris Conservatoire. And then he desperately wanted to come back and live in Canada. And he was a very good friend of another composer by the name of W.O. Forsyth. And if I can just sort of, as an aside here, I can really say that it was through my mother being a student of W.O. Forsyth that I really got interested in Canadian music because she had a lot of his compositions.
Bingo! You answered a question that I usually ask and didn't.
That's right.
So the origins of your interests. Yeah.
But because W.O. Forsyth had been a very good friend of Clarence Lucas, of course, my mother had compositions by Clarence Lucas as well. So I had got to know a bit about Clarence Lucas through his piano works. Um, and also the fact that he wanted to come back to Canada because he wrote these letters to W.O. Forsyth and said, "Oh, isn't there some place I can get a good teaching position in Canada and come back to Canada?" But
Oh,
W.O. Forsyth said, "No, you're better where you are." And so Lucas mainly lived between London, England, and just outside of Paris for most of his adult life. And he sort of went back and forth between those two places. He did a lot of editing work. I mean, even if you see some of the older editions of oratorios and so forth, you'll see that it was the piano reduction was done by Clarence Lucas.
that explains the beautiful orchestration of this score. It's
That's right.
beautifully
Yes.
orchestrated. It's
I
just a
know.
beautiful work of management, if you will, in terms of
Yes.
orchestration, color, as I said, harmonic projection, and progression,
Hmm.
and all the rest. Wow,
Yes.
Clarence Lucas. Well, thanks very much for that rundown on Clarence. And also, I just noticed because you mentioned something sort of, that Clarence Lucas spent some time in Paris, but it's Rudolf Mathieu. I hope. How do we pronounce his last name?
Rodolphe Mathieu. Mathieu. Yes.
Rudolf Mathieu.
Isn't that, yeah, aren't those wonderful pieces?
It's Alsace-Lorraine. He must be from. There's something German and French there. But anyway, the three preludes, so French, so
Oh,
incredibly
yeah.
French.
But
Suriname.
he wrote them before he went to Paris.
No, come on now. Well,
He did.
obviously he was driven something.
Well, he was in this amazing circle in Montreal of the early 20th century that was around the musician La Liberté. La Liberté um, had an amazing library of contemporary works of that time. And he had his students study those works thoroughly. So there was a lot of works by Scriabin, for
Mhm.
instance, in that library. Metner,
Very
and
advanced for the time. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, very avant-garde for
And
the time.
Mathieu wrote those preludes before he went to study in Paris.
Well, they're as French as they can possibly don't be, don't you think? They're impressionist, they're
Oh,
everything.
I just love them. I often perform the piano versions because I just love them.
Let's see, Suriname vague en muse. I hope I got
Hmm.
close as a Yankee.
Yes.
But in any case, three beautiful, beautiful preludes, and not played very often. I presume they're gorgeous, so they should be
Mhm.
known more. I hope my little effort at performingartsreview.net will be of some small help.
Yes.
What else? We've talked about Macmillan and that incredible tone poem. How about Georges-Émile Tarret, his Pavane? It's so lovely. It's a very short piece, but it's so lovely and gorgeous. What is? I mean, we're looking at a French name. What's that all
Hmm.
about? Oh, French
Yes.
Canadian.
Yes. French
Yeah.
Canadian. Hmm.
Quebec.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. And
And by the way, is there something very distinct? Here I get now. I'm going to jump right off the cliff into deep trouble here, speaking to
yes.
a Canadian. But is there in fact a very distinct difference? I think there is. That little quadrant of French speakers, the Quebecans from the rest of Canada. What? Tell me about that whole thing a little bit, and then let's talk about Georges-Émile Target and his Pavane.
Yes. Well, obviously, I find that the Quebecois composers I think, for the most part, are most exploratory in sound, for sound's sake, if I can put it that way.
Do you mean by that colors and
Yes, that's right.
timbres?
Yes.
Aha, yeah. Continue, please.
And but
Interesting.
there are also, when I wrote my book on musicking in the musical history of Canada, I was struggling with this because, on the other hand, I do find similarities right across the country, even though our geography, our topography, our backgrounds are can be quite different from one area of the country to another. But there seems to be some common threads, shall I put it that way? And what I found interesting in listening to this recording of the orchestral works, because it's so different to actually hear the sounds from just looking at black specks on
Yeah,
paper.
yeah, duh. It's often quite shocking.
It is. And I don't know whether I would be very interested to hear your reactions, but what I found was, listening to these works, some of the things that I feel are very, if I can put it in quotation marks, Canadian sounding, is this sense first of space. To a certain degree, you also find that in American
Oh, I'm
composers.
so glad you did that. I was waiting to
Yes,
pounce, but in a good
but
way,
I
because
think
you know what?
this is
We
part of the North American
Yeah,
continent.
and we have shared both countries. This is the big revelation for me, even though I knew better. I've been there, but I
Yes,
knew better. But in terms of music, we share this great plain. So
yes,
I'm thinking of wheat.
mhm,
John
yes,
Weinsweig's piece. I hope I'm pronouncing properly. Canadian
yes,
music for radio.
mm,
Wheat is the first movement. It is pure Great Plains. The big, just as Copland's sprawling, and any other
yes,
composer that knows that thing. So Canadians and Americans have a lot in common. Yeah, about these
yes, yes,
areas,
exactly.
this type of terrain that creates that kind of whatever it is, that kind of
Yes, which
vegetation.
I think is very different from Europe for Europeans.
Absolutely. It's huge. Europe doesn't
Yes,
have those kind of grand spaces. Yeah.
that's right.
Well,
And
please.
and so I find that, as I said, right across the country. But I think that for the most part, I still find that in many of the Quebecois composers, um, they're just still a bit more exploratory, perhaps in sound, atmospheric effects that they can do.
How French can
Uh,
you get? I mean, when you really
yes,
get right down to it, the
and
French
and I
are avant-garde. Yeah.
and I, in a way, I think it also reflects the dominant language, because French has so many subtleties that one does not find in English.
Yeah. Oh, well spoken, marvelous. Well, I see we're about out of time, Elaine Keillor. We have to end, but what a conversation. We've discussed a whole new technology in terms of creating an orchestral sound with fewer musicians. It's still very much live. It's still very much living human beings making music. But this wonderful guy, I've forgotten him, trying to Shelley Katz has obviously has the experience as a conductor and musician. All the rest, he's created something here with Symphonova that very discreetly and beautifully enhances the sound, so that, as you and I have discussed earlier, small little communities can have an opportunity to hear music they'll see the musicians, they'll see live musicians, but they'll experience a much bigger, more exciting sound that may send shivers down their spine, such as what we want. We're talking about the CD release by Centre Discs in Canada. We're going to put all this stuff up, plus the interview at performingartsreview.net. 2018 release. It's called La Patrie, our Canada. Canadian orchestral music from 1874 to 1943, and Elaine has been the curator of this delicious, beautiful, beautiful CD. And my last question to you, I asked earlier maybe, is okay, so 1944 to 2014, come on. You got to find the money and get going because
Oh,
it's a great service to all of us. I'm speaking the North American continent because I know a lot of Americans will really be interested in hearing this music
yes.
they've never heard before.
Well, we're working with the Canadian Music Center, and because Symphonova has to put all of its scores that they subsequently perform into their own digital
Mm.
format. Where I'm sitting on the National Council of the Canadian Music Center now, and we have so many works still in the Canadian Music Center that are not even digitized.
Mm.
So we're hoping that we can do some kind of liaison between these organizations and hopefully get more performances done. That's our dream anyway.
Yeah, and that is a great service for Canada. In other words, it should wave large flags to the government and other supporters. The idea of preserving recording in a budgetarily wise manner, if I may say so, if you're going to use
Mm-hmm.
Symphonova, as much as possible of this wonderful Canadian repertoire. And then, I'll do my little bit. We'll see if we can get some Yankees interested. And by the way, as you know, I think we've spoken. It's been such a treat, not only to speak with so many Canadian composers of late and to experience music I've never heard before. And I keep thinking I'm pretty sophisticated. Nah, I don't know anything about Canadian music and so on. It's just been such a treat with and other countries as well. So Elaine Keillor, I want to thank you for giving me some time late at night in Ottawa. Thanks again. We'll speak again, I think. See you. Bye bye. Thanks much.
Thank you so much.